Hi there, it's Craig here, and I'm going to talk about a bit of research for the showcase that I did with the Royal Air Force last year. The Tedder Academy at RAF Cranwell is the RAF's leadership academy, so they maintain the doctrine for leadership for the Royal Air Force. And 2019 was declared by the Chief of the Defence Staff, the head of all of the armed forces, as the year of empowerment for the military. So the Tedder Academy decided to commission a little bit of research to find out and ask a perfectly legitimate question as to what does empowerment actually mean when it comes to the armed forces, and particularly the Royal Air Force. So they asked me to come in and take a look at that, and so I did essentially a two-part piece of research, which I'm going to talk through. I don't have any slides or anything. I'm just going to spend 15, 20 minutes or so talking through the bit of literature review that I did on the subject of empowerment, which I did in a particular way, and then the research that I did and some of the conclusions that I came to. And the research that I did was a short study, ably assisted by Sunny D. Horton, who did some of the interviews for me. So thank you, Sunny D. And so we did 10 semi-structured interviews with a variety of leadership ranks in the Royal Air Force, from senior NCO all the way through to Air Commodore, a one-star rank, so one of the air ranks in the RAF, essentially at station commander level. So there's a fair variety of cross-section of leaders. And the way that we positioned the question was, and this is how I'd set it up with the RAF, is that if you could take two positions in the Royal Air Force, let's say a role in the Royal Air Force, and imagine an individual in that particular role who is considered to be empowering, and then imagine another individual in exactly the same role who is not considered to be empowering as a leader. Could you imagine that as being the case? And of course, in the military, when individuals change in and out of roles regularly, it is actually a way of evaluating whether there is such a thing as empowering leadership that sits, if you like, outside the formal rank structure. So in other words, something to do with the individual and the way that they conduct themselves in a role. When you have a role which is exactly the same and which is filled by two individuals, one of whom is considered to be empowering and one of whom isn't, by the team that they're the team that they're leading. So that was, this, if you like, the start point of the research. And the answer came back from the RAF: yes, it is absolutely possible to envisage that situation. And so part of our interviewing process was to see if we could identify some cases where that in fact happened. And sure enough, we had several examples of individuals who said, I had a leader who was either very empowering or very disempowering, who was then replaced as a leader was posted out by somebody who had precisely the opposite effect on their team. So it was possible to identify the characteristics of a leader that led them to be empowering or not empowering outside the formal hierarchy rank structure or the role or position that they had. And that led to some quite interesting conclusions that we drew. Now, all of this I've outlined in a white paper, which will be available as part of the showcase, where I review the literature briefly, and I'll just talk through that now, and just describe some of the conclusions that we came up with in terms of what empowering leadership actually means in the context of a hierarchy or rank-based structure. And one of the interesting parts about the literature review is I found that, at least so far, I've not discovered anybody who has written or studied the subject of empowering leadership in a rank-based structure. In fact, there were very few studies done in the public sector, full stop. And most of the work that has been done on empowering leadership has been done in the private sector and out with organizations like the military or the police. So that in and of itself, I thought, was an interesting conclusion for me anyway. And so which I think was one of the reasons why I think what we found was actually quite interesting and certainly interested the RAF, in their considerations of empowerment. So what I'll do is I'll just briefly review the literature, and I'm going to do it in a way which is slightly non-academic, because what I did was a particular type of literature review, which is something that I've always enjoyed doing myself, which is what I call a knowledge archaeology. It comes from Michel Foucault's work about the archaeology of knowledge, so that knowledge as an artifact has a birth, it transmits itself over time, it is produced, and that production of knowledge can be identified and uncovered and critiqued. So what I did was a little bit of a knowledge archaeology on the term empowerment through the literature. And so I started by asking, where did the term empowerment come from, and then turned into more of a discussion about where it was related more specifically to leadership. And that's really, I think, where the key of my empowerment work started from. And those who study management there'll be no surprises to guess that the first mention that I found of empowerment in the context of organizational power, not leadership, but organizations. So not related, for example, to female emancipation, which was one of the ways empowerment, I think, was originally started to get used in the 1960s. The first person actually to use it in an organizational sense that I found was Rosabeth Moskenter, one of the great gurus of management writing in the 1970s, way ahead of her time in some of the work that she did. And in a seminal work that she produced called Men and Women of the Corporation, she analyzed, I think possibly for one of the first times, the importance of power structures in organization systems as a determinant of leaders to get the group or subordinates or followers a sufficient set of resources and opportunities to make their job possible. So she first started to use the term empowerment in an organizational context, in the context of, in fact, what the word actually means, which is about the delegation of power and authority through the organization, which in the 1970s was quite a novel concept. So that was really the first time that the term empowerment was used. So actually, if you think about it, it's been used in an organizational context now for nearly 50 years. So it's not a new concept, as people will understand. But that was, I thought, quite interesting. Now, what I then did was start to understand the different ways that empowerment, the term empowerment, had been used in an organizational context since that first reference in the 1970s. And what I did was I developed a series of 5 categories which was supported by the literature. And those 5 categories referred to different ways that the term empowerment had been used in the organizational context from that very first mention. And the first and the earliest is, which I called cleverly category A, is what I call the environment for empowerment. So these authors had studied, like Moskenter, the structures and organizations and power dynamics of organizations that either contributed to or countered organizational empowerment. So that's the environments for empowerment. So that's the first thing I did. And that was really the context that Moskenter had been used in a lot of the early studies. Think about type Z organizations from Uchi. These were all things, these were quite ideological approaches to saying a modern organization should have these characteristics. And these were things like commitments to cultural, to individual values, collective non-individual pattern of interaction, consensual decision-making, participative management style, bottom-up processes for searching ideas from the shop floor, and some very influential studies, particularly in the early 1980s, which led to, for example, Tom Peters' book In Search of Excellence, which were all about encouraging responsibility at the lower levels of the organization for decision-making, problem-solving, divisional managers having control over outcomes, but not for processes. And so these were the sorts of ideas. There was a very influential HBR paper in 1985 by a guy called Walton called From Control to Commitment. It was about organizational, about gaining the commitment of employees. So this was the environmental context, and often, as I say, quite universal, dogmatic in some ways solutions that all organizations should be run in this way in order for us to be empowering. So that was one category, broadly chronologically, but not completely chronologically, I have to say. The next category started to investigate, I think probably broadly towards the end of the 1980s, something that was really kind of on topic for this research, which is the characteristics of empowering leaders. So it zoomed in on the style and the approach and the characteristics and the attitudes and the behaviors of leaders. who were considered to be empowering. And this was work that led primarily by a guy called Jay Conger, who first really came up with this sort of set of characteristics of what empowering leadership meant. So his characterizations was in 1989, providing a positive emotional atmosphere, rewarding and encouraging in visible and personal ways, expressing confidence in subordinates' abilities, fostering initiative and responsibility, and building on success. So this was a sort of, if you like, leading the search for the characteristics that empowering leaders demonstrated, usually through sort of these side ideas of listing sorts of behaviors. So another example that I quoted in the white paper from 2000, the types of leadership behaviors that proved to be most effective in an environment where empowered teams had been introduced as a type of organizational structure, in contrast to traditional hierarchies, found that through an instrument that was developed by Arnold in 2000 called the Empowering Leadership Questionnaire, measured the following behaviors: leading by example, participative decision-making, coaching, informing, and showing concern stroke interacting with a team. So these authors identified what they believed to be the definitive set of behaviors that empowering leaders could demonstrate and could be measured through this instrument called the ELQ, the Empowering Leadership Questionnaire. So that was around 2000, these sorts of ideas started to develop. And I'll just give you another example that was developed further, what some authors called self-leading behaviors, so the kind of leaders that allowed others to lead themselves, if you like, and they were found as the following: encouraging independent action, encouraging opportunity thinking, encouraging teamwork, encouraging self-development, using participative goal setting, and encouraging self-reward. So a lot of studies developing the idea that there was a set of characteristics that defined leaders who were considered to be empowering. There were other studies around the connection between empowering leadership and increasing employee desire for feeling empowered, relationship between empowering leaders and employees' creativity, positive correlation found. The empowering leaders who found two broad classes to empower, stimulating employees to self-develop, stimulating independent employee action without direct supervision. So I think people get the idea that there was this study that seemed to be sort of 1990-ish to the early 2000s, which was centered around identifying these characteristics of empowering leadership. The third category that I then delved into was almost like the sort of flip side, which is characteristics of the empowered follower. So rather than putting the lens on the leader, these authors decided to study what it was about followers that was so good about being empowered. And what they did was come back to some work by Bandura, very influential work, which was about self-efficacy, which he produced at the end of the 1970s. And so the central theory about the follower, if I can call it that, was about psychological empowerment. In other words, it was felt that the benefit on followers of empowerment was that it would increase their self-efficacy as defined by Bandura. And just as a quick revision, what Bandura identified as being four sources of self-efficacy was what he called enactive attainment, the successful mastery of a complex task; vicarious experience, which is observing others performing a similar role successfully; verbal persuasion, which is encouraging others to believe that they're capable; and an emotional arousal state, creating a supportive and trusting group atmosphere. So what these authors did was to talk about things like intrinsic task motivation that was felt or was found to increase depending on how empowered individuals felt. An intrinsic motivation was felt to be dependent on four judgments that individuals made. The impact to which the degree to which the individuals were felt to see that behavior was making a difference to the purpose of their task; competence, how well they felt they were trained to do it; meaningfulness, the value of the task; and choice, there was the actual choice that you have over determining outcomes for the task. So these were all felt to be ways that empowerment increased individual intrinsic, I should say, motivation to complete a task. So that was another area. So the third area of study, which was prevalent in the sort of 2000s, probably to 2010, which was considering the nature of empowerment on the empowered individual, if you like. And it was broadly felt to be a positive outcome for the reasons that I mentioned. The fourth area, so I've covered environment, characteristics of the leader, characteristics of the led in terms of the context of empowerment. The fourth area was the relational dynamics between the leader and led. And this is slightly more recent in terms of some of the studies that were developed. So it's the nature of the relationship between the empowering leader and the condition of empowerment of the follower, as I've just been talking about, leading to the idea that successful empowerment leads to something like an attunement between the behavior of the empowering leader, if you like, and the behavior of the follower in a way that is identified as a sort of expectancy matching between them. And actually, by the way, I found this quite insightful and, for me, intuitive in the literature. And this was actually something that emerged later from my study in the RAF, and also I'll come back to this one. And in 2018, for example, Lee and others reported 3 main positive effects of empowering leadership. So they reported that leaders who are empowered tend to be better at influencing non-routine task behavior, which in knowledge organizations tend to be the norm, such as creativity, citizenship behavior that's not formally recognized. They're more likely to be trusted by their employees. And empowering leaders had a more positive impact on employees with less experience or shorter length of service. It was found to be more motivating, intrinsically motivating. So one of the notable conclusions, coming back to the point about the relationship, is that the effect of leading by empowering others is determined by how employees perceive their leaders' behavior. And this is quite interesting. So for the first time, out of all of this sort of pretty much universally positive description of the effect of empowering leadership, people started to say, actually, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it could be perceived as increasing autonomy and decision-making among subordinates, and therefore trust. But on the other hand, it could be perceived as an act of avoidance of responsibility and reluctance to make decisions, in other words, opting out, and leading to worse performance on routine tasks. So, and for the first time, it was identified that empowerment actually leads potentially to variable results on routine tasks, that people who are engaged in that kind of activity, the increased autonomy or latitude that they're given by empowering leadership can actually have a detrimental effect both on their motivation and on their work performance, and can increase things like job tension, not paying attention to the task at hand, and so the authors put it simply: too much of a good thing can have a negative outcome. So that was quite an interesting conclusion, actually, for the first time starting to explore that there may be, if you like, a downside, not a dark side exactly, but a downside to being too empowered, as it were. So I found that quite an interesting set of conclusions from that fourth area in terms of the relationship between the leader and the led, and the dynamics between them, if you like, the effect of one on the other. And then finally, something that really wasn't that studied that well, but I know was of particular interest to the RAF, which is something that I identified called the trickle-down effect of empowering leadership. So this is the fifth category of literature that I uncovered. And very few studies have actually identified this trickle-down effect. So if you're an empowering leader at a senior level, what is it how does that affect, if you like, lower level leaders? So perhaps the leader who are perhaps 2 or 3 levels below you in the hierarchy. What effects are there between a leader at the top of the organization, potentially empowered, or somewhere at the higher level of the organization, and the organizational effects lower down? Now, interestingly, there's have been a little bit of work done on public sector, uniformed organizations, particularly the law enforcement organization in the US, very current at the moment, where a study there found that leaders in those organizations, or managers in those organizations, are more likely to use empowering leadership themselves or practices with their subordinates if they themselves feel psychologically empowered by their leaders. And that managers' perceptions of empowerment stem directly from their perception of how they're empowered by those above them. So some indication actually that there is indeed a trickle-down effect if one considers empowering leadership to be a positive thing, which, as I've said, isn't necessarily universally the case. That and what was interesting about this, because it's a rank-based structure, it's a hierarchy, it's a police in the US, that actually there is that trickle-down effect, that individuals in the if you like, the more junior managers and leaders in an organization may feel more empowered as a result of the empowering behavior of their leader. So that was quite an interesting piece, and that was done in 2018, so relatively recent. So my conclusion of the literature review, so 5 categories over time, roughly chronological in terms of the order at which they've been dealt with in the literature, starting from that very first mention by Moss-Cantor in the 1970s and leading all the way through to some recent studies that show actually in rank-based structures there is something of a trickle-down effect of empowering leadership. So that was the conclusion, if you like, of my literature review on the subject of empowerment, and more specifically on empowering leadership. And so to the data. So 10 semi-structured interviews, quite case-based. We were looking for concrete examples across a number of different ranks and rank structures. And what we found, and I'll jump straight to the fact that we, first of all, we did absolutely find that contrary to what the popular perception may be in what may be considered to be a very structured, hierarchical, rank-based organization, there is absolutely space for something called empowerment. So coming back to what I mentioned earlier, that leader A in job 1 can be considered to be empowering. Leader B in job 1 can be considered to be disempowering. And there were there were indeed some common characteristics of empowering leadership, having got some quite clear compare and contrast, where a subordinate that I was interviewing, or that Sunny D was interviewing, looked up, had a leader, leader A, was in exactly the same role, transferred out, leader B transferred in, very contrasting behavior in terms of empowering leadership. So what were the sort of common themes that they identified as being the ones that identified empowerment? Well, one of the characteristics was that they seemed to fall into sort of 2 types, which I sort of referred simplistically as soft and hard empowerment. So soft empowerment constitutes the level of support and trust the leader shows in his or her subordinates. So a dynamic of trust. The hard empowerment, and this in some ways is quite interesting in a rank-based structure, it relates to the way that a leader exercises his or her authority vested in them by virtue of their rank. And so there are ways of interpreting the authority given to you by the Royal Air Force that make you a slightly more or less empowering leader in the views of those around you. And that was quite an interesting set of conclusions. So in terms of the soft empowerment, what do they find? Well, trust and support, continuing theme, consistent theme. They seem to, leaders who are empowering demonstrate genuine trust in and support for the people that work for them. And much of this is affective, of course. It's the feeling that you get from the leader. It's about the feeling of being empowered, giving people a feeling of control in their environment, not complete control, but within the environment they're working in. Feeling that you can make decisions and that you'll have the support and tools needed to make those decisions, that you won't be constantly asked to justify your actions, so freedom from unnecessary oversight, giving people as much autonomy and authority as you can by telling them what they need to achieve and why, but not necessarily the how they're going to achieve it. So allowing them to go and find a way to make it happen with a feeling of shared purpose. And I'm actually quoting directly from some of the interviews that we transcribed as a result of the route. Being given the ability and rights to choose when I can make decisions, as well as my subordinates the options to make their own decisions. So hence that little bit of trickle-down effect coming out there. Being given an intrinsic feeling that there's belief in your ability to get a job done. So belief, feeling, intuition, support, trust. One respondent described it that an empowering leader feels themselves to be there to serve the people who work for them more than the people above them. And that's quite an interesting insight and distinction in the context of the RAF, which, of course, in a rank-based structure, like any organization, but particularly one based on hierarchy and elements of command, the relationship between that hard empowerment, how you use that command, and soft empowerment, those elements of trust, was something that emerged quite a lot from the discussions. What else? there are and I characterised these headings through particular phrases that were quite striking from some of the respondents. There are better and worse ways of doing command. So coming back to my point, which was very clear from the interviews, that often described the characteristics of an empowering leader replacing a disempowering leader, or vice versa, and describing the effects. And the effects are, there are quotes in the white paper, and I won't go into them in detail at the moment, but, and disempowering, everything I tried to do was wrong. It didn't matter what I did. Instead of letting me fly and letting me support him, which I was prepared to do, I was seen as a threat. So I went from being able to fly and being very productive to not being able to look left without doing something wrong. And my productivity and morale just plummeted. So you can see we've got some quite powerful descriptions of being disempowered. It was transactional leadership. I wasn't empowered. I was told to produce stuff by a time. You need to do this, you need to do that. I still applied common sense. Disenfranchised. I was thinking after 3 weeks, what am I doing here? This is ridiculous. And then he went and a new leader came in, different view of the organization. I was clear what he wanted from me, who I needed to engage with, what he required, while he took the more strategic stuff. I'm not going to get into your area, just do and get on with it, build those relationships, get on with it, buy those products, start looking for opportunities. So very, very clear contrast between the characteristics of empowering leaders and disempowering leaders in essentially precisely the same role. Lots of comments about operational duties. The respondents found that in operations, as opposed to routine work back at home, as it were, that they're given much more empowerment, and that's considered to be a more empowering set of circumstances. Unity of purpose much clearer. You don't fight against bureaucracy. The organisation isn't, inverted commas, marking your homework. You're resourced to task. More innovation. Much more operations focused. You're there to do that job, and you've got all the tools to do it. Feeling of shared purpose, shared hardships, being in it together. These are all things that lead to a much greater feeling of empowerment, but which could also be destroyed by a disempowering leader who wanted to constantly check up on what you're doing all the time. And then some very clear, results of that sort of empowering leadership behaviour. It's okay if somebody makes a mistake. We can work through it, learn from it together. Feeling good at work, laughing and smiling. My entire team is saying this. You get recognition, you get pat on the back, you get the well done. If you feel empowered and supported, you're willing to commit more, retain them, people will choose to stay. When you lead, that's when you give them the greatest opportunity to empower, give them the freedom to do stuff. They surprise you, they do more than they're delivered to do. There's often many areas of our organisation, grey spaces where there's not a right answer, that allows you to help people to contribute to a solution. If you empower them, they bend over backwards for you. So lots of positive ideas on the consequences of working for an empowering versus a disempowering leader. That's pretty conclusive, I have to say. Some other themes that emerged: empowering leaders take personal risk, and that means they will often subordinate their own ambition, their own how they're seen by the rest of the organisation, in service of the greater good of their teams. And that is a very particular characteristic that emerged strongly from the data. Like any organisation, leaders are assessed by and evaluated, most organisations, by the people above them. And sometimes what they came through the data, they were saying that the disempowering leader will essentially do what they need to do to get a good report by the organisation versus what their subordinates actually need the leader to do. And leaders are often felt conflicted between those two quite different sets of priorities. So these are this was quite and one of the ways that was characterised by a respondent was that the disempowering leader will pursue bigger badges, as they called it, so greater rank, more recognition, promotion. So the temptation, for example, for a leader to take credit for a solution or idea developed by a subordinate or subordinates in order to report this upwards through the formal appraisal system, or by a public assumption of credit instead of recognising the contribution of the team. Very disempowering for the team, but possibly, certainly in the short term, beneficial for the leader. That was picked out as a disempowering behaviour, and one where leaders will not have the courage, if courage is what it takes, to recognise the performance of a team, but to take credit for it for themselves. And that was felt as a vicious circle, particularly where you have sort of junior ranks who will then take that as the role model. Several of the leaders that I interviewed reported that they themselves, in various ways and to personal cost, had taken the decision not to be ambitious for themselves or interested in further promotion in order to give themselves a sense of freedom, perceived freedom, from the risk of that not occurring. So it was a psychological decision by a leader to say, I'm going to suspend my ambition in order for myself to be able to perform a better leadership task, and I'm just freed up from that need to show people above me that I'm doing really well. And that was one of the very interesting ideas that emerged, I think, from the data. Another one was doing the right thing, the right versus the easy choice. I know where it's worth picking the battles and have courage to go after those battles because it's the right thing to do either for your mission or for the morale of your team. Often requiring personal courage, speaking truth to power, for example, which came up, where a leader, him or herself, perhaps is feeling disempowered by their leader, and how they then manage that situation to create space for their teams to be empowered by basically telling their bosses where they need to back off. Not easy to do in any circumstances, particularly challenging in a rank-based structure. So that was one of the characteristics. Recognizing the expert, something that the RF is developing particular expertise in and of itself, and how they do that. So often these days, very junior ranks are more expert in a particular task than more senior ranks. That can present a challenge for the authority of the leader and their perception of what their role is. So the ability for potentially a very senior rank to put a more junior rank in charge of a project because they happen to be the expert in that project was felt to be very empowering. And of course, the opposite is also true. So that was one particular aspect that emerged, that increasingly the RAF is a very expert-driven technical service. And that was something that kind of came out, that just because you happen to be a senior rank doesn't mean to say that you have to be in charge of something if somebody is better qualified to be able to do it. A couple of interesting quotations that I learned that came out often in the research was the long screwdriver was a particular one that was felt to be disempowering. And actually leaders recognized in themselves quite uncomfortably where they had done it themselves. And this is where a senior leader will reach down perhaps 2 or 3 layers in the organization to try and fix something, hence the long screwdriver, that exists somewhere in their organization. For those underneath them, sometimes it's necessary to do that, but where it's unnecessary, that is often seen as disempowering, and sort of things like senior leaders with lots of stripes on their shoulder, worried about it before a particular ceremony about the way a carpet is positioned in one of the main rooms of the building. That is a sort of extreme example of the long screwdriver, sort of interfering in something that's going on below you, where you basically need to back off and let people get on with them, do it, and trust them to do their jobs. And that long screwdriver came out as an interesting expression of, if I can flip it round, condition of empowerment is that leaders don't pay too much close attention to detail. Tricky one to get right, because sometimes detail is important for a senior leader. Knowing when to pay attention to detail and knowing when to back off seems to be a really quite an important skill of an empowering leader, which empowering leaders was recognized in research, don't always get right, but something that came out quite strongly, this idea of the long screwdriver. Now, so just, I suppose a final one, which a couple of interesting ones. Getting to know my people came out very strongly. Put the rank on one side, find out who your people are, get to know how they tick. Critical, necessary condition for empowering leadership. Empowering upwards. A lot of people said, actually, you can empower your leaders. So think about it in the opposite direction. Several said that teams are empowering a boss to allow them to concentrate on what they need to concentrate on by taking care of the stuff that they need to do. It's a sort of extended version of the old thing about don't give your leaders problems, give them solutions. But that was quite an interesting thing that emerged, that actually it doesn't necessarily have to be downwards, that teams can work hard to empower their bosses, to make their bosses actually do their jobs better in an empowering way. A very interesting reflection. And then some stuff on that hard empowerment, understanding where the limits are on your authority that is placed on you, and thinking about it as boundaries and space, not thinking of those limits as limits or constraints, or at least the constraints being placed on you as a leader being only the start point, but understanding also where that still gives you freedom to operate. It was defined as the circle of influence versus the circle of control, that leaders who are empowering will still find space to operate, even in the most constraining of circumstances, often just by recognizing what they are and being clear with their teams on it, but then working with their teams to give them the room to operate within those constraints, whatever that particular situation happened to be. The final really key finding for me was this thing about synchronizing styles. And I mentioned that in the literature as being some of the later stuff about this idea of attunement between the leader and those being led. And this came out quite strongly, that a lot of the empowering leaders I was talking to seemed to have this ability to match their style over time to what is required by their particular circumstances and by the team. A bit more than the sort of classic thing about situational leadership. You change your style according to the situation. It's much more of a dynamic process than that, continually dynamic process over time. You're continually working to decide how best to position your style according to what is needed by your team, and the team do the same. So it's a matching of styles. They will adjust themselves according to how they see your leader working, and that seemed to me to be quite an interesting finding, supported a little bit by the literature, that this is both this upward and downward process that allows the synchronization of approaches, styles, and attitudes in a generally is found to be generally empowering as an approach, and that the empowering leaders particularly encourage. So they're not fixed. They don't sort of standardize the way they do things. And they're very attuned to the circumstances of a particular task and of their people, and they continually adjust their style according to those circumstances. So that seemed to be quite an interesting finding. So just as a sort of summary, what did I conclude in terms of the findings of empowering leadership in the RAF? So the conclusions were empowering leaders tend to put aside considerations of personal advancement or promotion, and in terms of where they have to, where it comes into conflict in the best interests of their teams and units, which requires acceptance of personal risk. They quickly establish and overtly and publicly demonstrate trust in their team and find ways of doing that. They explore and agree with their team the fine line between supporting behavior and negative behavior, the long screwdriver idea. Empowering leaders' supportive behavior entails agreeing and reviewing outputs with the team, not interfering with the task delivery, particularly when the leader knows more about the performance of the task of their team. So, if you like, the leader's the expert, more tempting to interfere. Empowering leaders don't do that. They recognize that their team has to be given the freedom to solve it, even if they think they perhaps know better. Ability to demonstrate supportive behavior is predicated on getting to know the team, often literally putting the rank aside, taking uniform off, going sitting them in the cafe, getting to know them as individuals. That is considered to be a necessary conditions of empowering leadership. Empowering leader allows expertise to trump rank, as I was saying. So expertise, regardless of your rank, is prioritized versus level of rank. And unlike traditional descriptions of leadership, they tend to ring fence a set of defined characteristics that can be performed in any circumstances. So the modern empowering leader is seen, I think, by them as a negotiated process, whereby a sense of balance is achieved, or meeting of minds, or agreement and approach between the leader and those being led. So this, as we were just talking about both being led and leaders, it seems to happen on both sides, and both up and down the hierarchy to the benefit of all parties. This idea of synchronizing styles, and a lot of time and thought and effort is put by empowering leaders into doing that. So in terms of just finishing off a little bit on that idea of hard empowering leadership, empowering leaders quickly establish and understand the limits placed on the performance of their leadership task and review those constantly. They then take an attitude, which seems to be a very particular choice, to consider those limits as a framework within which they can operate to empower. So that's a psychological choice, not to consider them oppressed by those limits, but to look for the spaces within those limits to empower. They can be large, they can be small, but that seems to be a particular choice that they give to operate. And then their teams can work within those spaces defined by the leader. And then the more that the empowering leader does that, identifies and preserves this space for action, the less they're likely to experience the long screwdriver from others, or or actually demonstrate those behaviour themselves. Their credibility grows, their room for manoeuvre increases as a result. So there's a sort of virtuous circle of finding the space to empower, not interfering where you shouldn't interfere, and therefore empowerment in the organisation tends to grow and multiplies as a result, and you get more space to operate as a result. And there we go. That's it. I probably talked longer than I should have done usually, but I found quite an interesting project, which, as I said, looked like something that hadn't really been done much before, which was studying the context of the modern context of empowering leadership in a rank-based structure. Not much of that done, not much research in there, and some important conclusions, which I think partly confirm what has emerged from the literature in terms of those 5 areas that I was talking about, but also perhaps just give 1 or 2 nuances and some interesting characteristics of that in the context of a ranks-based structure. And very strong conclusion in a given job, which has precisely the same role characteristics. One leader can come into that job, replace another leader, and those 2 leaders can perform that role in a very, very contrasting way, either empowering or disempowering. And that was a really strong conclusion from the research to confirm that. So there we are. My research showcase on the subject of empowering leadership in the Royal Air Force. And if you've managed to listen to this point, thank you for putting up with the discourse. Bye-bye.